The woman in the emerald coat walked into Holla Grand Hall like she had built it. 500 people, Jeju Island's most powerful food industry gathering, chefs who had cooked for presidents, critics whose single sentences had closed restaurants overnight, investors whose handshakes moved millions, all of them dressed for the occasion, all of them performing importance, and every single one of them stopped when she walked through that door. Not because of the coat, though the coat was extraordinary. Emerald silk, gold thread so fine it caught the light like moving water, a seal near the collar, 4 interlocked hands that made a food critic from Tokyo reach out and grip the arm of the woman beside him. "Is that the Obi seal?" Nobody answered. A waiter holding a full tray of champagne flutes simply forgot to keep walking. The woman moved through the silence like she had expected it, unhurried, taking up exactly the space she needed, no apology in any direction. Her name was Adaeze Obi, and 3 days ago she had been scrubbing pots in the kitchen of the most celebrated restaurant on this island. If you have ever walked into a room and quietly let it underestimate you, stay with this story. Like this video before we go further, and if you want more stories about women who know exactly who they are before the world catches up, subscribe right now. We are just getting started. 8 months earlier, the kitchen roster at Haenyeo restaurant listed her as Prep Station 4. Not Adaeze Obi, not Miss Obi, not even Adaeze most days, just you, the one at Station 4. She arrived before anyone else every morning, 4 a.m., the kitchen still dark, the Jeju coast outside the window still black. She would tie her apron, pick up her knife, and begin, deboning fish, reducing stocks, building bases that other people would finish and plate and take credit for, while she moved silently to the next task. She never corrected anyone. She never volunteered an opinion. She let inferior stocks go out on the nights she wasn't assigned to stocks and said nothing. On the nights she was, the kitchen ran at a different level and nobody could explain why. 3 scenes from those 8 months, each one worth remembering. The first, a junior chef from Daegu leaned over her station one Tuesday morning and told her with great confidence that her knife technique was wrong. She looked at him. She adjusted her grip. She finished the task his way without a word. That night, in her Jeju Sea guest house, she practiced both techniques side by side, hers and his. Hers was faster, cleaner, produced less waste. She wrote the comparison in her notebook without a single word of judgment, just data. The second, Chef Kang Jae-won, owner of Haenyeo, 3 Michelin stars, a face that appeared regularly on the covers of culinary magazines, conducted a kitchen tasting one Thursday afternoon. He lifted a spoon of Adaeze's reduction to his mouth, tasted it, set the spoon down, said without looking up from the bowl, "Who made this? This is close." The senior sous chef, standing 3 feet away, said, "That was mine, chef." Kang Jae-won nodded and moved to the next station. Adaeze picked up her knife and kept working. Close. 8 years of training across 3 continents, a palate developed in one of the most sophisticated culinary households in Lagos, and the best he had, close. The third scene, a delivery arrived addressed to Miss A. Obi. The front-of-house manager called across the full length of the kitchen. "Anyone know an Obi?" The way you might call for a lost umbrella. Adaeze raised her hand. He passed the package over the counter without making eye contact. Inside, a small sealed jar of fermented locust beans, packed carefully in cloth. Her grandmother's handwriting on the label. 2 words only. Still thinking. She held the jar for a moment, then she put it in her bag and went back to work.
That jar was part of something she had been building for 8 months on a single portable burner in her guest house room. One good knife, a notebook filled with fermentation ratios and flavor maps and experiments she ran alone every night after her shift ended. The dish, a fermentation fusion, Korean doenjang, the deep, slow, ancient paste that sat at the foundation of half the greatest Korean recipes ever made, and Nigerian iru, fermented locust beans, dark and complex, the ingredient her grandmother had used to build the reputation of the House of Obi across 4 generations. 2 traditions, 2 civilizations, both built on the same quiet truth, that time and patience and the right conditions could transform something ordinary into something that stopped people mid-sentence. She was not building it for Kang Jae-won, she was building it for herself as proof. Because Adaeze Obi had grown up in kitchens where her name opened every door, and she needed, with absolute certainty, in her body, not just her head, to know what she could open with just her hands. 3 weeks before the invitational, Adaeze called her grandmother. Mama Chidina Obi answered on the first ring, always answered on the first ring for Adaeze. "Mama, I'm ready." A pause. 1 breath. "I know. I have been waiting." "You're not going to ask me how I know." "I don't need to. You don't call me with questions anymore. You called me with a statement. That means you found it." Adaeze looked at her notebook. 8 months of anonymous excellence on a single burner, her handwriting filling page after page, not with doubt, but with discovery. "I found it," she said. "Then come home to yourself, completely." "The coat, Mama." A silence that contained a smile. "I'll send it with Auntie Grace. She'll bring the team." "You don't need to send the whole team." "Adaeze." "Yes? You spent 8 months being nobody so you could remember what it felt like to be yourself. Let me send the coat properly." 5 days before the invitational, Chef Kang Jae-won called Adaeze into his office for the first time in 8 months. She sat across from him in a chair that faced his wall of accolades, photographs with dignitaries, framed reviews, a shelf of awards that caught the afternoon light. He slid the invitation across the desk without preamble. "The Jeju Culinary Invitational, 3 years since the last one. It might be good for you to see how the industry looks from the other side of the kitchen." His tone was not cruel. It was something more difficult to name, the tone of a man who had decided, without examining the decision, that the person across from him occupied a permanent category, that the ceiling he had imagined for her was fixed, that his invitation was generous. Adaeze looked at the invitation, studied it with the same attention she gave everything. "Thank you, Chef," she said. "I'll think about it." She stood. She left. Kang Jae-won watched her go and turned back to his desk. The conversation was finished for him before she cleared the doorframe.
The morning of the invitational arrived the way important mornings always do, quietly, without announcement. The world outside unchanged, while everything inside it was about to shift. Adaeze was already awake when the knock came. 6 a.m. The Jeju coast outside her guesthouse window still gray, the sea flat and pewter under early light. She opened the door and found 2 women she recognized immediately. Auntie Grace, Mama Chidima's personal assistant of 19 years, small and precise, and carrying herself like someone who had managed the logistics of state dinners and never once broken a sweat. And beside her, a stylist whose name Adaeze had known since childhood, a woman who had dressed 2 Nigerian first ladies and once spent 40 minutes adjusting a single sleeve at a Lagos state function because the light was changing and the angle had to be right. Neither of them said good morning. Auntie Grace simply held up the garment bag. She said you'd know what it means. Adaeze stepped back and let them in. The coat came out of the bag the way it always did, slowly, the emerald silk catching even the weak morning light of a Jeju guest house and turning it into something worth looking at. Gold thread along the collar and cuffs and running in precise geometric patterns down the front, and near the left collar, the Obi seal. 4 interlocked hands, one for each generation of the dynasty. Adaeze had seen this coat her entire life, had watched her grandmother wear it at the Milan presentation when she was 9 years old, standing backstage in shoes that were too tight, understanding nothing about the industry, but understanding everything about the way the room changed when Mama Chidima walked into it. Had watched the coat travel in its own protective case to Lagos and London and Accra and back. Had been told since she was old enough to understand what it meant that one day it would be hers. She had not worn it once. Until today. Auntie Grace held it open. Adaeze slid her arms through. The weight of it settled across her shoulders, not heavy, but present, specific, the way a truth feels when you finally stop walking around it. She looked in the small mirror above the guest house dresser. The coat transformed nothing about her face, nothing about her posture, or the way she occupied the room. She had always stood exactly like this. Feet planted, shoulders level, eyes direct. She had simply been choosing to be quiet. Tucked inside the collar, folded once, was a card in Mama Chidima's handwriting. Angular and unhurried, the penmanship of a woman who had never written anything she didn't mean. A great chef does not announce herself, she simply cooks. But tonight, announce yourself. Auntie Grace watched her read it. When Adaeze folded the card and placed it in her coat pocket, Auntie Grace nodded once, the nod of someone whose job was now complete. "The car is outside when you're ready," she said. Adaeze took one more look in the mirror. "I'm ready," she said. Hala Grand Hall sat on Jeju's northern edge, volcanic stone and glass facing the East China Sea, lit from within like something that understood its own importance. The car stopped at the entrance and Adaeze stepped out alone, Auntie Grace and the stylist remaining in the car without being asked because they understood that this moment belonged entirely to her. She walked through the entrance and the room responded the way rooms respond to the undeniable, not with noise, but with a specific quality of silence, the kind that happens when 500 people register something simultaneously and none of them have the words for it yet. She did not pause, she did not look around to measure the reaction. She simply walked in the direction of the bar, her pace unhurried, her expression open and calm, and let the room do what it needed to do. It took 11 seconds for the first person to speak. A food critic from Tokyo, a man whose column had the readership of a small nation, leaned toward the woman beside him and said very quietly, "That is the Obi seal." The woman looked. "You're certain?" "I have been writing about that family for 20 years, I am certain." 12 feet away, a Korean-Nigerian cultural exchange coordinator who had been trying to reach the House of Obi through official channels for 14 months looked up from her phone, looked at the coat, and put her phone directly into her bag. And across the room, near the far window, where the East China Sea stretched dark and enormous behind the glass, Chef Kang Jae-won saw her. His first reaction was surprise. He had assumed she wouldn't come, half forgotten extending the invitation at all, if he was honest. It had been a small gesture, the kind a person makes and releases without expecting a response. And yet, here she was. Here was Prep Station 4 in a coat that was making a Tokyo food critic grip someone's arm. He started toward her. He had taken perhaps 4 steps when a hand landed on his shoulder. Jae-won-si, Chairman Huang, the man whose investment had funded Haenyeo's third MIL push. The man Kang Jae-won had spent 3 months cultivating toward a major hospitality expansion, dinners and tastings and careful conversations that had slowly, finally been moving in the right direction. Hwang was not looking at him. He was looking at Adaeze. "The woman in the coat, is she with your restaurant?" "She works in my kitchen, yes." Hwang turned to look at him, a pause so measured it felt deliberate. "In what capacity?" "Prep cook." The pause again, longer this time. "I see," he said. He excused himself and walked, not quickly, but with the specific directness of a man who had just identified the most important person in the room, straight toward Adaeze. Kang Jae-won stood where Hwang had left him and watched it happen. Within 20 minutes, Adaeze was at the center of a conversation that included Chairman Hwang, the Tokyo critic, a Culinary Heritage Foundation director whose endorsement had launched 3 international careers, and the Korean-Nigerian cultural coordinator who had finally, after 14 months, found the introduction she had been trying to arrange through official channels. She was not performing. She was not leveraging the coat or the seal or the name. She was talking about fermentation, about the precise and underappreciated parallels between doenjang and iru, about the centuries of scientific sophistication embedded in both traditions, and about what happened to culinary culture when the world stopped treating African food knowledge as exotic flavoring and started treating it as what it actually was. A system of preservation and complexity and philosophy as rigorous as anything the West had ever codified and published and called by an academic name. The people around her had their phones out, not for photographs, they were writing things down. Kang Jae-won watched from a distance, and something moved in his chest that he did not have an immediate name for. Not jealousy, not embarrassment exactly. Something quieter and more uncomfortable. The specific feeling of realizing slowly and without escape that something had been in front of you the entire time. His executive chef, Lim Soo-yeon, appeared beside him. She had been watching the room all evening with the same stillness she brought to her kitchen, observant, precise, withholding judgment until she had all the information she needed. She did not look at him when she spoke. I looked her up. Soo-yeon. Adaeze Obi, Mama Chidima Obi's designated successor of the House of Obi. 4 generations, Legos, internationally recognized, the kind of family that has a Wikipedia page in 11 languages. Kang Jae-won said nothing. She trained under 3 separate Michelin-starred chefs before the age of 24, none of them in Nigeria, all of them under different names. Apparently this is something the Obi women do. They go somewhere no one knows them, and they work, and they learn, and they wait. She never said anything. Lim Soo-yeon finally turned to look at him. "The doenjang reduction 5 weeks ago. The one you tasted and said was close." He already knew what was coming. He could feel it arriving. "That was hers," Lim Soo-yeon said. "Every exceptional stock this winter. The braised dish Chairman Hwang complimented in November. She built the base. Chef Park plated it. All of it was hers, Jae-won. All of it." The glass in Kang Jae-won's hand was suddenly something he needed to set down very carefully. "Why didn't you?" he started. "Because I didn't know until 20 minutes ago, which means she was that good without us knowing, which means she was that good while we were calling her Station 4. Silence between them. Across the room, Adaeze laughed at something the foundation director said. Genuine, unguarded, the laugh of someone entirely at home in their own skin. Before Kang Jae-won could move, Chairman Hwang found him again. The conversation was brief and surgical. "I have been in negotiation with a West African hospitality consortium for nearly 2 years," Hwang said. A deal that requires a Korean culinary partner with genuine cross-cultural credibility. The House of Obi is the most influential member of that consortium. I understand. I don't think you do yet, Hwang said, not unkindly, but without softness. I have spent 2 years trying to secure an introduction to that family, and you had the heir cleaning your stock pots. He let that sit. Fix it, Jae-won, or don't, but understand exactly what you are deciding tonight. He returned to the room. Kang Jae-won stood alone for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he went to find Adaeze. If this story is landing the way it should, hit that like button right now. It tells us to keep making stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment, because what happens next on that coastline terrace is the scene this entire story has been building toward. He found her outside on the terrace, the East China Sea below, vast and dark and moving, the Jeju coastline stretching in both directions, the kind of view that made everything that happened inside rooms feel appropriately small. She was standing at the railing, her coat catching the night wind, her expression entirely untroubled. He heard her approach. She did not turn around immediately. "Chef Kang," she said. "Miss Obi," he said. The name felt different in his mouth now, not because the name had changed, because he finally understood what he was saying. He stood beside her at the railing. Below them, the sea moved against the volcanic rock, steady, indifferent, ancient. He did not start with the investment. He did not start with the apology he had rehearsed in the 30 seconds between the bar and the terrace door. He started instead with the only thing that felt honest. "The reduction I called close, it wasn't close," he said. Adaeze said nothing. "It was exact. I knew it when I tasted it. I said close because—" He stopped, started again. "I said close because I had already decided who you were, and what I tasted didn't fit that decision, so I adjusted the tasting instead of adjusting the decision." The sea moved below them. "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 8 months, Adaeze said. "I'm aware." She turned to look at him then. Her expression was open, genuinely open, without performance, without the careful neutrality she had worn in his kitchen every day for 8 months. This was her actual face, attentive, intelligent, patient in the way that only people who are very certain of themselves can afford to be patient. "I'm not angry with you," she said. "I need you to understand that clearly, because what I'm about to say will sound like anger, and it isn't." He nodded. "I was never vulnerable in your kitchen. Every morning I chose to be quiet, and every morning I could have chosen differently. The invisibility, the way your kitchen was structured, the way credit moved, the way assumptions traveled, none of that touched me. I was watching it. I was letting it teach me." She paused. "But there are women in your kitchen right now, Nigerian women, women from the Philippines, women from places you've never thought to ask about. They don't have a grandmother's coat to put on when they are ready. They can't choose to be quiet because the silence was never theirs to choose." She held his gaze. "That is the part worth fixing, not my story, theirs." Kang Jae-won was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved across the terrace. Below them, the Jeju ancient coastline absorbed the sea the way it always had, without resistance, without ceremony. "What would you fix first?" he asked. It was the first genuinely curious question he had ever asked her.
Adaeze looked at him, and for the first time in 8 months she smiled at him like he had finally said something worth responding to.
They stayed on that terrace for 40 minutes. Not a negotiation, not a performance of reconciliation, a real conversation, the kind that only happens between two people who are extraordinarily good at the same thing and have never actually spoken before. Below them, the East China Sea moved against the Jeju coastline, steady and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. Adaeze told him about the dish. "I have been developing it for 8 months," she said, "on one burner in a guest house room. Korean doenjang and Nigerian iru, fermented locust beans, two preservation traditions built on the same instinct from opposite ends of the world that have never been put in conversation with each other at a serious culinary level. Why not? Because the people who control serious culinary conversation have not traditionally looked in the direction of Nigerian kitchens for sophistication." Kang Jae-won absorbed that without deflecting it. "Is it finished, the dish?" "It has been finished for 3 weeks," she said. "I was waiting for the right kitchen to serve it in." "You could have served it in mine." She looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who was capable of understanding it, but hadn't yet. "No," she said, "I couldn't. Not because of the kitchen, because I needed to know it was mine first, completely mine, before I put it in front of anyone." He was quiet for a moment. "What were you actually testing in my kitchen? You said you were letting it teach you. What were you learning?" She thought about it genuinely. The wind moved across the terrace, and she let it. "Whether I loved cooking when it gave me nothing," she said, "when my name meant nothing, when the work disappeared into someone else's credit and nobody saw it and nothing came back to me. Whether I would still get up at 4 in the morning and care about the quality of a stock that nobody would ever know I made." "And every single morning," she said, "I cared every single morning." He looked at the sea for a long moment. "I have something to tell you," he said, "and I'm telling you not because it changes anything between us professionally. I'm telling you because you just told me something true, and it deserves the same in return." She waited. "The techniques Haenyeo is most celebrated for, the fermentation methodology, the preservation approach, the way we handle depth of flavor, I built those on foundations borrowed from culinary traditions I never once publicly credited. West African fermentation science, Southeast Asian preservation techniques. I read everything I could find. I applied what I learned. I won awards for it, and I never named the source." The sea below, the wind above, the specific silence of a confession landing. "Why are you telling me this?" Adaeze asked. "Because you just told me the part worth fixing in my kitchen, and I think you already know what the part worth fixing is for me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I do." Another silence, but different from the first one. This one had space in it, room for something to grow if someone chose to tend it. "Will you tell me?" he asked. "What to fix first, specifically?" "Credit," she said immediately. "Start with credit. Every technique in your kitchen that came from a tradition that is not yours, name it on the menu. Name the origin, not as a footnote, as a feature. Make it the thing you're proud of, rather than the thing you absorbed quietly." "People will ask questions." "Good," she said. "Answer them." He nodded slowly, not performing agreement, actually thinking. She could see the difference. She had watched him closely enough for 8 months to know exactly what his face looked like when he was performing and when he was genuinely processing. This was genuine. "I would have given you a station," he said quietly, "if I had known." "Chef Kang." He stopped. "Please don't finish that sentence, not because I'm angry, but because the version of that sentence you're about to say, 'I would have given you more if I had known you were worth more,' is the exact problem. I ate your stocks all winter. You complimented them without knowing they were mine.
That honest palate, that was the truest response you could have given me. That was all I ever needed from you." She turned back toward the sea. The knowing should come after the tasting, not the other way around. He stood with that for a long moment, let it settle into him the way a well-made stock settles, slowly, completely, changing the flavor of everything it touched. "What did you need from yourself that you came to find?" he asked. "I already got it," she said. 2 days later, Adaeze packed her guest house room. It did not take long. She had arrived with 2 bags, and she was leaving with 2 bags and a wooden crate containing her fermentation jars and 8 notebooks dense with the most important work of her culinary life so far. The guest house room was small, and the walls were thin, and the single burner was temperamental in cold weather. She had been entirely at home in it. She was wrapping the last fermentation jar in cloth when she heard the knock. She knew before she opened the door. Kang Jae-won stood in the corridor looking like a man who had rehearsed nothing and decided that was the right choice. He was not carrying anything. He was not wearing his chef's whites. He looked, for the first time in 8 months, like a person rather than a position. "I'm not here to offer you anything," he said immediately. "All right," she said. I have one question, and then I'll go." She stepped back from the door and let him in. He stood in the small room and looked at the packed bags, the wooden crate, the bare shelf where the fermentation jars had lived for 8 months, the single burner on the counter, wiped clean. "Why did you stay 8 months, genuinely? You could have left after 3. You had everything you needed after 3 months at most. Why did you stay?" Adaeze set down the jar she was holding, thought about it, not performing consideration, but actually revisiting the question as if she were asking it of herself for the first time. "Because 3 months told me I could survive it, but I didn't want to survive it. I wanted to love it. I wanted to know that I could do the worst version of this work, the invisible version, the uncredited version, the 4 in the morning version, and still feel at the end of every shift that cooking was the thing I was supposed to be doing with my life. And every single day," she said, "I loved cooking the way you love something that asks nothing back, the way you love the sea or the early morning, not because of what it gives you, just because of what it is." Kang Jae-won was quiet. "I don't know if I love it that way," he said. It sounded like something he had not said before, like the words were waiting for the right room. "I know," Adaeze said, not unkindly. "That's worth knowing about yourself." She picked up her bag. He moved to the door. "The kitchen will be different. I don't know how yet, but it will be different." "I hope so," she said. "Not for me, for the people still in it." He nodded. He left. She carried her crate to the car and did not look back at the guest house, not because it hadn't mattered, because it had mattered completely, and that meant she could leave it. If you are still watching, you already know this story is different. Subscribe before the next part, because what Adaeze builds on this island in the months that follow is the reason the whole 8 months existed. Stay with me. 7 months later, in a whitewashed stone building on the Awol coast, Jeju's artisan neighborhood, where the light came in sideways off the sea and everything felt like it had been made by someone who cared, the Obi Jeju residency opened. Not a restaurant, something more difficult and more important, a living culinary laboratory, a dining experience, and an apprenticeship built specifically for the people who had spent their careers making other people's kitchens run, quietly, without credit, without their names on anything. Mama Chidinma had seen the building 2 years prior to a visit to Jeju, had walked through it alone on a gray November afternoon, and stood in the empty main room where the light came through the sea-facing windows and landed on the stone floor in long, pale rectangles. Had bought it quietly, told no one, and waited. She gave it to Adaeze with a single sentence: "Every great cook needs a kitchen that belongs to them." The inaugural cohort arrived on a Tuesday morning, 12 people. A woman from Lagos named Blessing, who had worked banquet prep in Jeju resort hotels for 6 years and had never once been asked by any executive chef what she thought of the menu. A man from Abuja named Emeka, who ran the stock station at a J-Sagi-Pro restaurant and had constructed quietly and without acknowledgement the flavor foundation of that kitchen's most celebrated dishes. A woman from Cebu named Rowena, who baked the pastries for a celebrated Jeju cafe, whose owner, when asked in an interview about the secret to his success, had spoken for 4 minutes without once mentioning her name. A woman from Tashkent named Dilnoza, who deboned fish in 3 different Jeju kitchens and been called the foreign one in all of them by people who considered this a sufficient form of identification. 8 more. Each one with the same story, each one extraordinary, each one invisible in the places they gave their best work. Adaeze stood before them on the first morning in the A-wall kitchen.
The sea visible through every window, the fermentation jars already lined along the shelves, the smell of the place already becoming itself. "I'm going to tell you one thing," she said, "and then we are going to cook." They waited. "You are not chosen because of who you know, or what kitchen you came from, or what language you speak, or what country put your passport together. You were chosen because of what I watched you make when nobody was watching you." She looked at each of them in turn. "That is the only qualification that has ever mattered to me, and it is the only qualification that will ever matter in this kitchen." Blessing from Lagos pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly, the specific gesture of someone receiving something they had waited a long time for. Emeka from Abuja exhaled slowly, like a man setting down something heavy. Rowena from Cebu said nothing, but her hands, which had been folded tightly in her lap, opened. Opening night. The Obi Jeju Residency's first service. Adaeze plated the dish herself. She had not assigned it to anyone. This one was hers to serve. The Doyenjang Iru fermentation fusion. 8 months on one burner. Every adjustment, every failed ratio, every 2 a.m. recalibration recorded in a notebook that was now full. Every page of it leading to this bowl, on this table, in this room, on this coast. She placed it in front of the Tokyo critic who had recognized the coat at Hala Grand Hall 7 months ago. He looked at it for a moment before lifting the spoon, smelled it first, the deep, complex, layered fermentation meeting the sea air coming through the open window. He tasted it. He put the spoon down. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Adaeze. He looked at the bowl again. "How long have you been working on this?" 8 months officially. My whole life, actually. He picked up his pen. He did not write a rating. He did not write a score or a ranking or a number of stars. He wrote 3 words and underlined them once. "This changes things." Kang Jae-won was there that night, a guest, nothing more, nothing attached to his attendance except a reservation made under his own name like anyone else in the room.
He ate the dish. He sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with something that has reorganized something inside you, and you need a moment to understand what has moved and where it has gone. He found Adaeze near the kitchen pass after service. "I told you it was close," he said. "You did," she said. "I was wrong." "Yes, it was never close," he said. "It was already exactly what it needed to be. I just didn't have the framework to recognize it." "Most people don't," she said. "That's not a permanent condition. It's a choice. You can build the framework. It takes longer than tasting a reduction, but it's the same instinct. You pay attention, you stay curious, you adjust. Is that what you did in my kitchen? Every single day, she said. He nodded slowly. The kitchen is different, he said. I want you to know that. We renamed 3 dishes last month, credited the traditions they came from. The team asked questions. I answered them. It was uncomfortable. Good, she said. It was, he agreed. It was exactly the right kind of uncomfortable. He looked at the room, at the 12 apprentices moving through it, talking to guests, plating, carrying, inhabiting the kitchen with a particular quality of presence that was different from any kitchen he had ever run. Not the tense, hierarchical precision of Haenyeo. Something more grounded, more, his mind searched for the word, more earned. What do you call this, what you've built here? Adaeze looked at the room, at Blessing carrying a dish with the precise confidence of someone who had finally been handed the right stage, at Emeka deep in conversation with the foundation director about stock methodology, talking with his hands, animated, entirely himself. I call it the beginning, she said.
Midnight. The Obi Jeju residency kitchen after the last guest had gone. The apprentices had cleaned their stations and filed out slowly, reluctantly, the way people leave a place that had given them something they did not expect to receive that evening. The candles on the dining tables had burned low. The fermentation jars along the window ledge caught the moonlight coming off the East China Sea and held it, amber and gold, like something preserved. Adaeze stood at the kitchen pass, alone. She was not doing anything, not cleaning, not writing in her notebook, not planning, just standing in the kitchen that belonged to her, the first kitchen that had ever belonged entirely to her, and letting the evening settle. The smell of the place was extraordinary. Doenjang and iru layered beneath sesame and sea air, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been used well. She had spent 8 months carrying that smell in her memory, in the guest house room, in Haenyeo's fluorescent mornings, in every moment when the experiment felt long, and now it was here, real, hers. She picked up her phone and called Lagos. Mama Chidinma answered on the first ring. She always answered on the first ring for Adaeze. It did not matter that it was midnight in Jeju and early evening in Lagos, and that Mama Chidinma had her own service to oversee, her own kitchen humming behind her. The first ring, always. How did it go? Adaeze looked at the kitchen, at the clean stations, at the notebooks the apprentices had left open on the counter, Blessing's handwriting filling half a page with flavor observations, Emeka's diagrams of stock ratios, Rowena's careful notes on fermentation timing in a mixture of Tagalog and English that somehow made complete sense. It went like the beginning of something, she said. Mama Chidinma was quiet, the particular quiet that Adaeze had known her entire life, the quiet that contained a smile and a history and 20 things unsaid because they did not need saying. That is the only way anything good ever goes, she said finally. The dish landed completely. I know. You can't know, Mama, you weren't here. I know because you said it landed completely and not just well. You don't use that word loosely. Adaeze smiled, moved to the window, the Jeju coast below the building, the sea moving in the darkness, the volcanic rock steady and ancient and entirely unbothered by the significance of the evening. Mama, she said, Thank you for letting me go be nobody for a while. The silence on the other end of the line shifted, became something warmer and more serious simultaneously. Adaeze, listen to me carefully. I'm listening. Adaeze,
You were never nobody, not for one single morning of those 8 months. You were choosing to be quiet. There is a difference between those two things, and it is not a small difference. It is everything. Nobody has no choice. Quiet is a decision. You chose it. You owned it. You ended it when you were ready. Adaeze pressed her hand flat against the cool glass of the window. Outside, the sea. I know that now, in my body, not just in my head. That is what I needed you to know. That is the only reason I let you go. A pause. When are you coming home? Adaeze looked at the kitchen, at the fermentation jars, at the open notebooks, at the pass above which she had already decided, though she had not yet told anyone, she was going to hang something. Soon, but not yet. There is more to build here. Good. Build it well. Always. Adaeze. Yes? A beat, the kind of pause that carries a lifetime in it. I'm proud of you, not because of the coat, or the dish, or the residency, or the critics' 3 words. I'm proud of you because you asked yourself the hardest question, and you stayed in the room until you had the answer. That is the only courage that matters. Adaeze closed her eyes for a moment. Good night, Mama. Good night, my heart. She hung up, stood at the window for a long time, the sea below her moving the way it always moved, without asking permission, without announcing itself, simply and continuously and completely itself. Then she went to her bag, took out her fermentation notebook, the one that had traveled from Lagos to Jeju, that had lived through 8 months on a guesthouse shelf, that was now full from the first page to the last. She set it on the counter at the kitchen pass. She opened it to the very last page. At the bottom, below the final entry, the completed ratio for the doenjang iru dish, dated 3 weeks before opening night, she wrote 4 words. Then she closed the notebook. Then she turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the Jeju coast at midnight, volcanic rock, and the East China Sea, and a kind of silence that was not empty, but absolutely full of salt and wind, and the particular quality of an island that had been here long before anyone arrived to find it significant, and would be here long after everyone had gone. She stood in it for a moment. Then she walked to her car and drove home through the dark Awul streets, the sea always somewhere to her left, the island solid and ancient beneath her. In Lagos, the Obi Jeju kitchen was finishing its evening service. The main kitchen, warm terracotta walls worn smooth by 4 generations of hands, high windows that let in the last of the evening light, the smell of something that had been fermenting since before Adaeze was born. The kitchen where she had learned to hold a knife before she learned to read, where she had stood on a wooden step-stool at the age of 4 and watched her grandmother's hands move with such certainty that seemed to a 4-year-old like a form of magic, where she had understood, long before she had the language for it, that food was not just sustenance, it was argument, it was memory, it was the most honest thing a person could make with their hands. Mama Chidinma stood at the pass, the place where finished dishes went out to the world. Above it, a new sign had been installed that afternoon, while the Obi Jeju residency was setting up for its first service, while Adaeze was plating the dish on the other side of the world, while 12 people who had spent their careers invisible were putting on their aprons in a kitchen that knew their names. Hand-lettered on a piece of pale wood, simple, no flourish, no frame, just the words in the same angular handwriting that filled a card tucked inside an emerald coat. She went to learn what she already knew. Mama Chidinma looked at it for one quiet moment, the way you look at something that is finished and right and needs nothing added to it. Then she picked up her knife and went back to work. Back in Ewul, Adaeze's fermentation notebook sat on the kitchen pass in the dark. Last page, bottom of the final entry, 4 words written below 8 months of work. If you could have seen them, they would have read, "Now, build what's next." The most powerful woman in the room had been scrubbing that room's pots for 8 months, not because she had to, not because the world put her there and she had no choice to stay, because she had a question that only that room could answer, because she needed to know, in the marrow of her, in the hands that held the knife at 4 a.m. when nobody was watching. 8 months, 1 guest house room, 1 burner, 8 notebooks. The answer was yes, completely, and without condition, yes. The talent was hers, the love was hers, the work, every stock, every reduction, every 2 a.m. adjustment to a fermentation ratio in a room that smelled of the sea, had always been entirely, irreducibly hers. She had not needed the coat to know that, but she had worn it anyway, because some truths deserve to be announced, and some rooms deserve to walk into like you built them. If this story stayed with you, if Adaeze's 8 months meant something to you, leave a comment below right now. Tell me the moment it hit you hardest. Was it the kitchen, the terrace, the dish, the phone call to Lagos? Tell me. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. This channel exists for exactly this. Stories about women who know who they are before the world figures it out. Women who choose their silence and end it on their own terms. Women who build kitchens that say names out loud. Subscribe, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, because the next story is already coming, and it is going to be worth staying for.